It's session 2, the invention of rationalism, and we're going to begin with Homer. We had ended with him in the first session, and then move straight through the late archaic period into the early classical period, and talk about those scientists and thinkers who are referred to as pre-Socratic philosophers, even though calling what they do philosophy is going, as you will see, is going to be a stretch. And it's going to be a setup for moving directly into the high classical period next week, when we talk about the development of history as a discipline and tragedy as a discipline, and Herodotus in the Golden Age. Anyhow, with that said, to the first slide. So we had ended talking about Homer, and a few comments on the Iliad and the Odyssey before you'll see how I want to use them for our purposes today. And I say, according to the tradition, that there was a Homer, a blind poet. It's been contested, but all sorts of text analysis seems to indicate that there was a common author of the Iliad and the Odyssey. Internal text criticism seems to indicate that. And this Homer, if he was the blind poet of the 8th century, the 700s, produced the first literary versions of what we now know to have been oral epics. We don't know whether he added a lot to the content and the sequencing of those oral epics, whether they were very divergent before his time, and he set them into a kind of fixed literary final format, or whether he followed fairly closely to those oral traditions, lost in the mist of time. But by the end of the 6th century, these poems, and they're both in dactylic hexameter, dactyl long, short meter, and 6 to the line, had become the foundation of the Greek literary canon. Everyone grew up on their Homer in the Greek world. The Iliad covers a few weeks in what is a 10-year siege of the city of Troy, which was discovered, by the way, by Heinrich Schliemann in the 19th century. He found the site. He had to dig down through several Troys because they built cities on top of the old cities. And then when he got to about 6 layers down, he said, here's the one from the Iliad. It's a story of both tribal and individual glory. And the arch hero, Achilles, or Achilleos, as the Greeks would have called him, fulfilling his great destiny before his preordained, of course, his fated tragic demise, his Achilles' heel. There's a quarrel between Achilles and Agamemnon, king of kings of Mycenae, and it's interlaced with the exemplary themes of honor, pride, rage. First word of the Iliad is rage, piety, love, and courage, all the virtues that the young Greek children were schooled on, sitting around the evening fire, listening to the rhapsode chant, the story that they all knew so well. The Odyssey follows the wanderings and the struggles of a very different kind of character, Odysseus, Ulysses in the Roman world, to return home to his wife, Penelope. And this book, one thing that makes it a significant departure is that women and slaves have significant roles. It's just not simply the story of heroic men fighting their destiny down to the last drop of blood. And so it investigates themes of friendship, fidelity, and testing. Will you be faithful to me? After I'm gone for several years on my struggle to get back to you, it's almost a Western. Will you still be there when I get back? You can see Gary Cooper playing the Odysseus in this one. Now, the thing I wanted to focus on and leaping from or using Homer as the connection between the oral stage of intellectual development and early philosophy is that orality oral poetry, oral epics, oral recitation were a device constructed, among other things, to help the singer, author, rhapsode maintain memory. In the 1920s, a classicist, a groundbreaking guy named Milman Parry, developed the theory that the Homeric epics were originally part of an oral tradition. Up until that point, even people in the know, suggested that this was a creation, a literary creation, fully formed out of the head of Homer. His thesis rested on the use of formulas called epithets. And epithets are things that you refer to people as. It's Achilles of the strong arm. It's Odysseus of the wise counsel. It's the phrases that are used as formulas to plug in to a poetic line to fulfill the meter of the line and to be at the disposal of the poet who finds himself, the singer, I should say, who finds himself adrift in the middle of the recitation, telling the narrative. They're aware of the story, quite aware of where the narrative plot leads them, but they might find themselves in the middle of a line, in the middle of a hexameter line, needing X number of syllables inflected in a certain way, stressed in a certain way, so that the meter holds. So he's like a calypso singer, where they're making up certain phrasing on the fly, or rap, if you will, where certain rhyming is part of the standard kit of the singer, of the artist. You're telling the narrative, and you might have 15 things, stock phrases, that you can use to describe Agamemnon, or you can use to describe Odysseus or Achilles, and you can pick the one that fits the need of the line that you've drifted into. Your spontaneous recitation has led you down a certain path, and you have to improvise. So you pull this stock phrase out instead of that stock phrase. So the bard could remember the essential narrative and improvisationally insert stock phrases, often of little contextual sense. Sometimes the phrase you pull out because it's metrically correct, but it doesn't really make any sense in the context that it's used. So you have sacker of cities, beloved of Zeus, man of twists and turns. And if at the time, your main character, if it's Ajax or whomever, and he's thrusting his short sword into somebody's guts, and you refer to him as man of twists and turns, it sort of doesn't make much contextual sense, but that's okay. It's a kind of fill in the blank memory aid that the audience would have been used to hearing. It's important that, if you will, that the limerick scans. There once was a man in Ohio, etc. So memory did not need to be literal, as long as you knew the basic plot line. It wasn't as if you had to memorize all of Hamlet to get to the end of your story. And these stories were 12,000 lines long. There were several mini narratives within the narrative. And so you committed the essential story to memory. You could follow the plot line of the story, but at the same time, you could be improvisational in the moment. In the 1930s, by the way, Parry was born early in the century, like 1902, 1903, something like that. And he died in 1935. So we have a sort of a tragic career here. But in the late 20s and in the early 30s, to prove his theory, that the Iliad and the Odyssey were probably oral initially, he traveled to mountain regions of particularly Bosnia. And it was a largely illiterate region in the 1920s and 30s, and recorded hundreds, even thousands of hours of Serbo-Croatian bards called guslars, who were reciting from memory and using exactly the techniques that he was able to identify in the Iliad and the Odyssey. Here's a picture of Parry in the middle with two of his guslars, two of his oral poets. So by hitting on this idea that memory was the key to understanding the tradition, the backstory to the Iliad and the Odyssey, he was able to make sense of why, for instance, the goddesses of all the arts, the muses, the nine muses, have as their mother in Greek myth memory, mnemosyne. It's the mother of all art. And I have one painted vase picture up in the upper right of, here I can, Odysseus and the Sirens. And so the classic story, everyone had the essential features to the story. And the rhapsode was responsible for, if you will, turning it into song and poetry that thrilled the audience and that would suck them into the experience, as we were talking about last week. Now, epithets and meter, as we've been talking about them, Homer's epithets for a specific character carry usually relevant associations, but not necessarily, as I said, for the given context. The important thing was the variety of meter so that one could be found to fit a verse. So basically, you were going to associate with a character 10 or 12 or 15, depending who the character was, metric phrases that varied quite a bit in the syllabication. So in this table, I've listed the epithets that are used. And by the way, this is an incomplete list. There are more than this for Patroclus. And you can see how they are associated with him. He's son of Menoetius, Zeus-born, dear to Zeus, great-hearted, horseman, peerless, peer to gods in council, gentle, hero. But if you look at the Greek, Menoetiades, Diogenes, Zeus Philos, Megaletor, Ipeus, Amumonos, Theophin Mestor Atalantos, Aeneas, Heroi, you can see how they would fit into all sorts of different places in a given line. They've got different lengths and they've got different melodic pitches. And that's the point with the red star. Ancient Greek is believed to have used a melodic or a pitch accent. In some ways, I suppose there would be some similarities with Chinese or Mandarin, where pitch is significant in distinguishing between words. Each syllable in Attic Greek, ancient Greek, contains a vowel with one or two, what they call more, a sound which comes after a short pause to determine the stress. An accented more is pronounced at a higher pitch. Now, I've taken the first 8 or 10 lines of the Iliad here, of book 1, and in English, you get, the movement. This is from the Fagles translation that was done in the 1990s. Other translations might say, it might scan better in English, sing goddess, the rage of Peleus' son. But he wants to emphasize that the first word and the thematic structure of the Iliad is rage, and the first word is, in the Greek on the right, it says menin, with the word for rage. Rage, gotta sing the rage of Peleus' son Achilles, murderous doom that cost the Achaeans countless losses, hurling down the house of death so many sturdy souls, great fighter souls, but made their bodies carry on, feast for the dogs and birds, and the will of Zeus was moving towards its end. Begin, muse, when the two first broken clash, Agamemnon, lord of men, and brilliant Achilles. Now, in the Greek, I can read the Greek, but I can't do it justice melodically or by pitch. So I would read the first two lines if I were doing it as back in Greek class when I was in college. Menin aede theia Peliadio Achilleos, ulumenen he muri Achaios alge eteke. But now I just want to play. I found someone who sounds to me like a native Greek speaker who would have been sensitive to the rhythms of Attic Greek, even though modern Greek has absolutely nothing to do with Attic Greek. And I will just play him. And it's the first two lines, the two lines I just read. So the sense you get is that there would have been a real flow to this, with a kind of almost hypnotic engagement that I imagine that the hearer would be drawn into. And there is a vase painting of the hero Achilles up on the right, and that allows us to move to the issue of literacy. Now, remember last week, I gave you a version of this chart, and I said, we're going to be talking about the movement from tribal organization to political organization. And I spoke a bit about the function of the new social organization called the polis that it potentially had on this transition. And there will be much more to say about that as we move on into the course. But I want to focus for our purposes here on the movement from oral transmission to literary transmission, from oral epic poetry to prose, from formulaic narratives for singing to be sung to discursive text for reading, because there are going to be, and we're going to talk about them in about 30 seconds, there are going to be a number of theorists arguing that the mentality, the mentalité of the literate mind is completely different and works in different ways than the oral form of thinking that would have preceded it. And in terms of content, mythic explanation, which is filled with concrete thought and gods and things animating the universe around in mysterious ways, humanity, is going to give way to what we're going to look at today. Rationalist attempts to explain the world without reference to mysterious gods. And the reason I always call the gods mysterious is because when you say the god moved the thing, there is no further question. You can't ask another question. The God is the answer that stops questioning. It's not a theory. It's a deus ex machina. It's the God in the machine. It's the explanation that stops explanation. It's the explanation that leaves the reader or the student or the investigator without a follow-up. There's a magic answer. It's the parent telling the child, because I said so, because I'm your mother. That's the final answer. It's done now. We don't have another question. But now we'll see the beginnings of a tradition where answers are themselves the next set of questions. And it's going to be a product of the development of methods of literary transmission. So to talk about the impact of literacy, another classicist, they're coming out of the woodwork now, a man of the same generation as Milman Parry, a man named Eric Havelock, but who lived much longer. He lived a full life, if you will. And in 1963, much under the influence of Parry, by the way, I think Parry's recordings of the Gouslars are in the Columbia Library. I think there is a section that has all of those. I don't know why Columbia, I guess he was associated with them. But Havelock in 63, he published a very famous book called Preface to Plato, in which he argued that there were significant differences between oral and literate modes of thinking, and that by Plato's generation, the modality of literacy was fully entrenched. In oral culture, this sort of epitomizes argument for our purposes here. In oral culture, the ideas are driven by narrative storytelling. They are associative, temporal, they're in time, they follow narrative time. One thing happens, it's like watching a movie. There is the time movement of the film, if you will, and they're concrete. The vivid, specific episode takes precedence over the whole. So you admire it and you identify with it, and you as the engager, as the audience, are locked into the sequence of specificity in a very concrete way. In literary culture, ideas apply more to the whole and to the general. They're abstracted from the specific. Most notably, the flow of time has stopped. The reader can go back. You now have a book in front of you. Oh, what was that reference on page 30? Oh, what did the author say about this character? I can stand back from the text. I can slow the motion down, which I can't do in the oral experience. And I can evaluate it in a still, reflective frame of mind. I can be not the audience for the film, but I can be the film critic, if you will. I can stand back from it. I can think about it in larger contexts of that director's other work, that actor's other work, history of the cinema, whatever. I can take a literary, abstracted, rationalized consideration of it from a distance. Now I can stop time. I'm outside of time. There's an opportunity here to measure, to compare, and to judge. We're going to see what Plato does with this when we get there, because he does a lot with this when we get there. So, literacy, by mid-century, literacy was begun finally to be considered a technology. So you have Marshall McLuhan. Thanks, Doris. Doris has pointed out that in several countries where girls cannot go to school, many issues are presented orally. That's true. However, I would argue that it's done orally from a quasi-literate standpoint. You're trying to capture the literary analytic experience, but using oral techniques to do it. But we'll get back. We might be able to talk about that later on. Anyhow, but in the 60s, Marshall McLuhan, we're all of the generation that can remember the splash that Marshall McLuhan made with his medium is the message. He popularized the idea that each communications medium is an extension of human sensation and thought. Changes in dominant communication systems result in cultural shifts. So his focus happened to be on the impact of printing in the 16th century and the impact that that had, Luther's printed Bible, that sort of thing, and of radio and television in the 20th century. Radio, his quintessential hot medium, as he called it, and TV, his cool medium. And he used this tetragram on the right to analyze the impact of a given medium or culture. So when there's a change in the technology, McLuhan was trying to suggest there are things that are now obsolete as a result of it. I don't know what your memory is like these days, but having Google in your pocket certainly has had an impact, I would think. What did the medium bring back in spades? Does it enhance certain experiences? Does it reverse the loss of something earlier from one of the other changes? So he's trying to ask all these questions. So his question isn't so much about the content as what the medium does to the content, what the medium does to the message, as he puts it. A student of his named Walter Ong, just a brilliant man, who lived entirely within the 20th century. Jesuit priest, historian, student of McLuhan, really a philosopher, and like I say, a man of much greater substance than McLuhan, actually, argued that writing itself was also a technology and caused a major shift when developed within what he called the primary oral culture. And he talked about this shift in mentality from holistic immersion in the oral world to interiorization and individuation in the literate world. Oral cultures require strategies for preserving information, he pointed out, and he not beyond listing epic poetry with its stylized heroes and epithets, he also talked about oral societies as repositories of proverbial thought, where people epitomized wisdom as proverbs, shorthands for the sake of memory, to get the messages across. Aesop's fables, if you will. Writing makes these usages obsolete, since cultures vary along a continuum between full orality and full literacy. Talked about three sort of stages of literacy. One, primary oral cultures, which never knew writing at all. Cultures with craft literacy, and we find this in places like Egypt and in the great Asian empires to the east of the Greeks at this time, where there was writing, but it was mainly record keeping and that sort of thing. And then cultures in a transition phase from orality to literacy, which he called residual orality. And in effect, the Greek world that we're talking about would have been that world. So there was probably an immense distinction between the intellectual contingent of the newly minted historians and philosophers and physicists and the like that we'll be looking at over the rest of the course, and many of the common people. But that this class of the literate will grow to the point that by the time you get to the 1st century BC, Hellenistic culture, as it's called at that point, meaning the world that turns to Greek science, philosophy, and literature as the curriculum, and this included the Roman Republican world of the 1st century, the world of Cicero and Julius Caesar. By this point, any Roman of aspiration and a little bit of wealth would import Greek pedagogues to tutor their students. Maybe if they really had money, people like Cicero went to study in Athens the same way that in the American world, of Henry James or the English world of the 19th century, people would go to Paris, the center of Western intellectual achievement in the 19th century, really, for the finishing school that they expected culture to offer. Anyhow, with that done, let us turn to the philosophical tradition. So I call this first line the birth of naturalistic thinking, meaning that explanations for how the world works are going to be theorized on the basis of observable natural phenomena and not mythic explanations or theological explanations. So in the late 6th century, so beginning as early as the 570s and 580s BC in Greece, and certainly in the early 5th century, so certainly into the 470s. So call it the century from 570 to 470, if you will, Asia Minor and the red box, much of which these are Greek cities, Ionian Greek cities, who are, for the most part, paying tribute to some satrap, some local governor of the Persian Empire to maintain some semblance of independence and chafing under the cost of it, but still able to pursue a predominantly advanced Greek culture within the Persian Empire, which, of course, and we will talk about this more in next week, was a patchwork of nationalities, and the Persians just sort of sat on top of it and allowed everybody paying their taxes in good faith to sort of carry on with business as they normally would. So Miletus on the coast, you can see it there above Halicarnassus, was the epicenter for theories about the natural world that went beyond religious or mythic explanation, which was, as I said, by definition, shrouded in mystery. They were called, or later on, thinkers called them the physikoi. The word physis is Greek for nature, and the physikoi were the physicists, if you were, or closer to the Greek meaning, the naturalists. They were interested in explaining causation and change in the natural world. Why does something change the way it changes? How does it work? How does something become something else? What does it mean? What's a chemical change? What's a physical change of one kind or another? To observe the natural world is to observe change. And the word for change, I have it down in that second bullet, kinesis in English. The dynamism of nature had to be explained without resorting to animism, without saying, well, the reason that the squirrel is running around looking for acorns and nuts isn't because of some god that is moving the squirrel. So let's try to figure out, how did this come to be? What are the causes? What are the rules of physical change? And what they hung their hat on initially was the idea of a source or a beginning. And they used their word arche, as in archaeology, the study of beginnings. Creation had to be explained, and any change had a material change had to be explained. And an arche could be thought of as a starting point, but it could also be thought of as the material cause or the first principle of things, that you look for principles built into nature itself. Let's do physics. Let's do chemistry. The earliest one of these, and he was really early because he was born in the 7th century actually, was Thales, or Thales in English, of Miletus, He's the first of the physicoi. And he, looking at the fact that living things were comprised, the bodies of living things had a lot of water in them, and that when they died, they, if you will, dried out. He used this as an early suggestion that, and he did it in a fairly sophisticated way. When you hear Aristotle and some of the others talk about the way he probably meant it, and it sounds like a very primitive concept to us, but it was an attempt at generalizing a source, an arche, from observation. It was primitive, saying something, everything's made out of water, and to be followed by other people say, oh, you're wrong there, Thales. Everything that lives has heat and temperature, so there is fire in things. When they die, the fire goes out, everything must be made of fire. There are others, it's the four substances. Others are going to say later on air, and others are going to say earth. And because look what happens when bodies decompose and the like. Many attempts of this order to name an aspect that is observable of the world, in the world, as the source of change. A major breakthrough, a man of about 15 or 20 years younger than Thales, also from Miletus, is Anaximander, young contemporary, and he introduced the idea, and this is a simply gigantic idea, that the thing, that stuff that underlied the stuff of the world, the thing that took on different characteristics, if you will, was not an observable substance. It was not an observable substrate in and of itself. It was something that you could only posit as indefinite. There was, and he called it the apeiron, the indefinite. And it's the original concept of the word. Think of the word substance, or think of the word substrate. Substance literally means in Latin, that which stands underneath. So if you talk about a change, whether it's the change from water to ice or water to steam under different conditions, for Anaximander, the concept is that this original substance, which the mind can get to as an idea, as a necessary idea to explain change as far as he's concerned, but it's an idea that can only be reached conceptually. You can't see the indefinite in a world where everything that you see is definite, in a world where everything is realized, is actualized. And he says, no, the fundamental reality that stands under stuff, below stuff, the substrate, the substance, the materia, this must be deduced. The fundamental stuff of the world is not directly sensible. You can't see substance. You see the actualized substance that's taken on a particular form. Reality, for him, the fundamental reality has to be deduced. How many of you understand quantum physics? I can't even get close. I can get remotely close, but I can't understand it the way a mathematician or mathematical physicist can understand it, because the way their explanations are lodged in a mathematics that I'm not equipped to deal with. And they're telling me that this is the fundamental reality of the universe. After skeins of deductions that have been made over a period of several centuries and confirmed by experimental traditions that prove certain points. And here we have Anaximander in the 6th century BC, who already intuited the idea that when you finally were going to make a useful explanation, a useful theory, because the explanation is not even final, it's just going to lead to more questions, which is the way theory works. It's not a mysterious answer, oh, the God made the change. It's a theory that deduction was going to have to provide. Thought, reason, quiet the mind. This is not something that could be encapsulated by a rhapsode in a heroic song. This is something that you're going to have to stop and think hard about and argue pro and con dialectically in argument. Anyhow, then along the way, a generation and a half or two later, another important Ionian philosopher from Ephesus, you can see on the map here, it's just north of Miletus, Heraclitus of Ephesus, who's probably the most important of the Ionian philosophers because he had this immense influence on Plato, and who probably flourished around 500 BC. He even raised the ante a bit further. He wanted to suggest that understanding the universe was not just a matter of understanding that there is some kind of original substance underneath things, but that the internal structure of the universe, and he used the word logos, which is the word for word. It's also the word for reason. It's also the word for rational format, if you will. It's the word that we use as a suffix on all those sciences that end in ology, physiology, biology, etc. It is the internal structure of the topic that we have taken in hand here. So he moved beyond the simple idea of an original substance by proposing that the underlying principle and structure of the world is fundamentally hidden and obscure, and that rational analysis was only going to be achieved by philosophers, was going to be wildly beyond most people because it's going to be a level of complexity to it. And this quote of his, of the logos, which is, as I described it, men always prove to be uncomprehending, both before they have heard it and when once they have heard it. For although all things happen according to this logos, men are like people of no experience, even when they experience such words and deeds as I explained when I distinguish each thing according to its constitution and declare how it is. Anaximander had pointed out that elements in the world that were formed out of the indefinite were linked, aspects of them were linked as pairs of opposites. So hot and cold, wet and dry, and that these poles, he said, were at war with each other within the thing, if you will. Heraclitus argued that things contain opposites in themselves as a unity, that when something undergoes a change, for example, from hot to cold, the thing itself remains the same. It's still the same underlying thing. And he's anticipating the idea of the concept of form, which we'll get to post haste. Despite constantly ping-ponging between its opposite properties, the essential object persists. And he made famous a statement from his book, No Man Ever Steps in the Same River Twice. It's this constant, if you will, transitional universe, all this movement around us, everything in one big melange, moving from one thing to its opposite. The road up and the road down are the same thing, he suggests. And what's the takeaway here? Not only must reality be deduced, but it's obscure and paradoxical. He distinguishes between what he calls being and seeming, trying to get to what something actually is, as opposed to what many people presume it to be, what it seems to be, becomes an effort in this universe. Also, in the 6th century, there is a man well steeped in legend. We don't know much about the actual Pythagoras, but we know a lot about the school of those people who tend to call themselves Pythagoreans. And although he's born also in that part of the world, Ionia, he travels to, as legend has it, to southern Italy, and much of Pythagorean thinking develops in southern Italy, from Croton all the way down to Reggio Calabria, the tip of the toe. He's the source of traditions that had a tremendous influence on later philosophers, particularly Plato. He founded a school in Magna Graecia, Greater Greece, as it was called, by the Romans, it was called Magna Graecia, in Croton. His followers led ascetic lives. So there was a kind of moralistic lifestyle associated with the school of philosophy. They adopted vegetarianism. They were cult-like. They were sworn to secrecy. And there are two central traditions associated with Pythagoras. The first tradition was all about purification of the self. And these people were called acousmatikoi. And the English word acousmatic refers to a sound that doesn't have a known source. Where did that sound come from? Pythagoras allegedly lectured from behind a screen. So the people who heard him could not see him. And so they became known as the acousmatikoi, the acousmatics. There's an emphasis on ritual and religious purification, disciplines of various kind, purifications of various kind, leading to, and the word for purification in Greek is katharsis. So leading to catharsis. Pythagoreanism was an influence later on in Greek mystery religion and various kinds of cults, all of which had to do with purification, rebirth, and immortality and the transmigration of souls, metempsychosis. And again, this will have a huge influence on Socrates and Plato later on. And the basic format is this little tripod that I suggested in the image at the bottom of the page, that the contemplation of the universe. So contemplation, the word is theoria. So the theory or the theoria of the cosmos, which is the word for order, leads to catharsis. And so philosophy became a way of making yourself better and getting closer to what is universally good in the universe. So this kind of moral philosophical tradition is, as well as the physical scientific tradition, is also born in the late 6th century BC. And so we have quoted by Porphyry. By the way, the fragments we have of all these people are obviously We have a few things that come close to originals because there were copies made of copies made of copies. But most of what we know are in comments made by either Hellenistic writers or Roman writers who did have access to documents that got lost after the burning of the library at Alexandria by Julius Caesar, or the collapse of Rome, Roman education and intellectual achievement in the late antique period. So, in the beginning of the medieval Dark Ages. So this is from Porphyry, one of the commenters in the Christian era. Nonetheless, the following became universally known. First, that he maintains that the soul is immortal. Next, that it changes into other kinds of living things. This is why they couldn't eat animals. Also, that events recur in certain cycles and that nothing is ever absolutely new. And finally, that all living things should be regarded as akin. Pythagoras seems to have been the first to bring these beliefs into Greece. And he probably was. Now, the more familiar association that we have with Pythagoras is Pythagoras as the mathematician, and the followers, this group of followers who were also called Pythagoreans, with the so-called mathematikoi, and they weren't interested in the purification rituals and the cult-like following. They were interested in the universe of number, observing the applicability of mathematical principles to aspects of the physical world. The Pythagoreans assumed the primacy of number and formal relationships. So number for them became imbued with mystical qualities. They, like the soul, it was higher, pure, and eternal. So number, as the basis of the physical world, they saw geometric proportions, the Pythagorean theorem of triangles, harmonics, they realized were organized mathematically. You could look at ratios and determine the harmonics of sound. And so number measured, you couldn't see number. Number was a formal reality. It was an abstraction, but it could be used to classify, categorize, and describe the things, the particular physical things in the universe. So number was seen as universal and eternal in and of itself, but that it described, and in some ways for them became the source of things in the physical world. They knew they were onto something. They knew they were on, that this is more than just a description. So, and this long quote or set of quotes comes from Aristotle about the Pythagoreans. The Pythagoreans devoted themselves to mathematics. They were the first to advance the study, and having been brought up in it, they thought its principles were the principles of all things. Numbers are by nature the first principles, and in numbers they seem to see many resemblances to the things that exist and come into being, more than in fire and earth and water. Such and such a modification of numbers being justice, another being soul, and reason, another being opportunity, and similarly, almost all other things being numerically expressible. They thought number was the way the universe somehow got defined. They saw that the attributes and the ratios of the musical scales were expressible in numbers. Since then, all other things seemed in their whole nature to be modeled after numbers. And numbers seemed to be the first things in the whole of nature. They supposed the elements of numbers to be the elements of all things, and the whole heaven to be a musical scale and a number. The music of the spheres was one of their concepts. For they construct the whole universe out of numbers, only not numbers consisting of abstract units. They suppose the units to have spatial magnitude. So in the early thinking, while number was an abstraction, it had a spatial reality. It actually had, if you will, size. how it's hard for us to wrap our minds around this as an idea, but this is something that they consider to be the case. So for them, the fundamental stuff of the world is formal, number, and it is universal and eternal. Now, also in Italy, up towards south of Naples, Elea was a town near Poseidonia, which is the modern Paestum, famous for its temples. Elea is near some Italian town now, the name of which I do not know. There's no such place by that name now. And the early 5th century, a school of thinkers from Elea, so now we're in the later period, we're in the 490s and 480s. And these are people who were influenced by the Pythagoreans. And they took issue with the vagaries and imprecision of sense data, of perception. They were really bothered by the idea of perception, sense data, and what you could conclude by seeing it as an aspect of reality. They argued that sense data was merely appearance, and that reality, what they called beings, the first time that being as an abstraction, as a term, evolved. And that being could only be known through the strict application of logic. So the most famous of these, Parmenides, or Parmenides in English, who flourished in the 470s, his so-called Floroid, was the major thinker of this school and a huge, significant influence on everything that followed. Great influence on the development of classical philosophy. His book had one section called The Way of Truth, aletheia, truth, and another called The Way of Seeming, or The Way of Opinion, doxa in Greek. And he wanted to distinguish the way of seeming from the way of truth. And as he saw truth, he develops a theory, you could call it a monism. The world is a single thing. He examines what reason, rigorously applied and unaided by the senses, can deduce about being. And the word he used for being was estin. It is. What exists simply exists. Language, the verb to be, can be deceptive when it falsely asserts that an existence is not, or that a non-existent is. Modern linguistic philosophers still have a great problem with the concept of referring to a non-existent, but I don't want to go there. So being is whole, singular, indivisible, timeless, and changeless. It is Tahem, as they would have called it, the one. One way only, this is from Simplicius, a late Roman commentator, one way only is left to be spoken of, that it is. And on this way are full many signs that what is, uncreated and imperishable, for it is entire, immovable, and without end. It was not in the past, nor shall it be in the future, since it is now, all at once, one, continuous. For what creation wilt thou seek for it? How and whence did it grow? Nor shall I allow thee to say or to think from that which is not, for it is not to be said or thought that it is not. And what need would have driven it on to grow starting from nothing, or at a later time rather than an earlier? Why now? Thus it must either completely be or not be. So coming into being is extinguished and perishing unimaginable. Let's ask ourselves what's going on here. He's doing an analysis of the way logic has meaning, and consequently, the way propositional language has meaning. To say something is the case is simply, if something is the case, It cannot not be the case. Language, when it postulates something, when it predicates something, predicates the thing as a fully existent. So in talking about the world that changed, let's go back to Heraclitus, let's go back to Thales. And the acorn grew into the oak tree. Cold water became hot. Well, if cold could become hot, is the suggestion here, then it has no meaning. Cold only has logical meaning as cold. It fully is. It cannot not be cold. It can't be what it is not. And if hot is what it is not, well, that's what things look like on the surface, he says. That's the way of seeming. That's doxa. That's what your senses are telling you. But I'm telling you, the way logic works, he's suggesting, is such that a thing is a thing is a thing. It is simply what it is. And that fundamentally, this is an aspect of all reality. So reality is all one big simple thing for him. And change, what you think is changing, has somehow got to be an illusion. And we're going to need Plato and Aristotle to explain the way out of this as we get there. The way of seeming and the analysis of being, Parmenides pointed the way to Plato's epistemology, the theory of forms. And we'll see how that works in a slide or two. In this section, he examines in the way of seeming the opposites, the device of his predecessors to describe becoming or change. For example, something hot becoming cold, an interesting exercise given that change is an illusion. So he says, yeah, he says, I know what it looks like to you guys out there, but we got a real problem with this. Now, his student and number 2 guy, and a major player in his own right, Zeno of Elea, much younger follower of Parmenides, who Aristotle credits with the invention of dialectical argument, became famous for his paradoxes that he used to defend Parmenides' critique of perception. And I put 3 of the paradoxes on the page here. And you probably are familiar with these, or you've seen them somewhere or other before. So Zeno's paradoxes make the case that motion, change, and plurality are all illusions. In each case, he takes an assumption of the early philosophers about the divisibility of space, time, or motion and creates a reduction ad absurdum, an infinite regression. So his first paradox, remember Achilles and the hare? They're having a race. And he wants to argue, Achilles was the famous runner. And he says, well, he can't outrun a tortoise who's given a head start. And how come? He says, well, analyze it this way. He says, Achilles here's the little helmet for Achilles. He's at this point, and the tortoise starts off halfway to the goal. So Achilles, before he gets to the end and wins the race, before he gets to the finish line, Achilles has got to get to the point that the tortoise started at. Before he can get to the end, he's got to get to the point that the tortoise started at. But at the moment that he gets to the point that the tortoise started at, the tortoise, not covering that much ground, not moving very quickly, he's a little further along. And by the time Achilles gets to that point, the tortoise is again slightly little further along. Notice how the 2 dots are getting closer and closer. And then by the time Achilles gets to that point, the tortoise is yet again a little bit further along. And it's going to be an infinite regression. And he says, therefore, logic would tell you, unless you can refute this, and I'm not here about to try to suggest the way Aristotle and some others refuted it, just to say, his suggestion was that the dictates of analysis, the critical use of logic, indicate that the motion that Achilles can overtake the tortoise, an illusion. And then he uses the runner going, this is the so-called dichotomy, the runner getting to the running around the stadium and finishing the race. And he says, well, before he can finish the race, he's got to go through the halfway point. And he says, oh, before he can get to the halfway point, he's got to get into the halfway point of the halfway point, which is the quarter point. Oh, before he can get to the quarter point, he's got to get to the halfway point of the quarter point, which is the eighth point. And before he can get to the eighth point, he gets to the 16th point. And before he gets to the 16th point, he gets to the 32nd point. And before he can get to the 132nd point, he's got to get to the 164th. And what we have here is another infinite regression. And he said, well, it's absurd. He can never get to the final end of the stadium. And then he uses the arrow in another case, and I don't want to spend too much on this. Is a harder one to understand. The arrow, before it gets to the target, has to be in several different places along the way. So arbitrarily, here's place 1, here's place 2, here's place 3. But the arrow can't be in separate places in the physical universe outside of time, he wants to argue. And I don't want to get into this, but basically he sets up another infinite regression, that there are an infinity of these places that the arrow can occupy, as if it's occupying an actual physical space. So between the archer and the target, there are an infinite number of these full places that the arrow can occupy. So from Parmenides and Zeno, we get the suggestion that the fundamental stuff of the world, being, is whole, singular, indivisible, timeless, changeless. Logic is the gateway to truth. Now, there were people who took issue with this, needless to say, in the 5th century, even before we get to Plato and Aristotle. There were people arguing, there were also Ionians. And so they were among the physicoi, but they didn't like the single ingredient theory of the arche. And the first of those was Anaxagoras of Clazomene. Clazomene is also in Asia Minor, but he sets up a school up here in Thrace near Amphipolis. He makes the suggestion that the world is a mixture of primary imperishable substances. Material variation of particular objects was caused by the different mixes of the essential ingredients. And this argument gets refined by a very mysterious figure whose life we know very little about, Leucippus. And by the way, whenever you see a C and a Greek name that you want to supply an S sound for, a sibilant sound, Greek didn't use, it didn't have a letter C. It would have had a K, and it would have been a kappa. It would have been Leucippus, and Thucydides would have been Thucydides. In other words, I don't know when in time. It's probably taken from Roman usage, because Romans would use the letter C here, but they would have pronounced it hard. It's not veni, vidi, vici in Latin. It was actually pronounced veni, vidi, vici. So the soft C would have been a hard C, and that's probably why we have a C. And people want to say Leucippus, but Leucippus or Leucippus. And his follower, Democritus of Abdera, that's up here. And they're atomists. So they piggyback onto Anaxagoras, that there are primary imperishable substances, but they say these substances are called atoms. And so from Simplicius, we have this comment: for while Parmenides regarded the whole as one, motionless, uncreated, and limited, and forbade even the search for what is not, he, Leucippus, posited innumerable elements in perpetual motion, namely the atoms. Again, incredible for an ancient theorist to come up with this, right? And held that the number of their shapes was infinite, for he observed that coming into being and change are incessant in the world. And further, he held that not being exists as well as being, and the two are equally the causes of coming into being. We'll see what Aristotle does with this. The nature of atoms he supposed to be compact and full, that he said was being, and it moved in the void. So he creates a sense of the universe as a void, which he called not being. And the same way his associate Democritus posited as principles the full and the void. And then Aristotle says, since the void exists no less than body, it follows that not being exists no less than being. The two together are the material causes of existing things. These two men say that the differences in atoms are the causes of other things. They hold that these differences are three: shape, arrangement, and position. Now, I'm doing a slide in effect to make sense out of the problems these guys are trying to wrestle with, and how later Greek philosophy harmonizes what looks crazy and one-off into a kind of coherent theory. And it's mainly Aristotle. Well, Plato does it too, but the most famous solution to the physical problem becomes Aristotle's. So the problem, in the 4th century, Aristotle would point out that each of the pre-Socratic schools had made valid points about the problem of explaining the world. The idea of substance, take from the early physicists. The Milesian philosophers had rightly observed that the fundamental issue was to explain physical change without recourse to magical thinking. Their contribution was essentially that there had to be a substrate or substance that stood beneath the change. Something permanent existed through the change, or else it would be the magical appearance of something from nothing. The Pythagoreans contributed the idea of form. They had rightly observed that there was a mathematical dimension to things, and that number was purely formal and abstract. It never changed. 2 is 2. 2 doesn't get, you don't warm up 2 and have it grow into 3. 2 is 2. And then the idea of being, the Eleatics. Parmenides and Zeno had rightly observed that being could not change, or else language and logic would be entirely absurd. Cold can't become hot. So what he comes up with as a solution is the so-called theory of hylomorphism, from 2 words: hyle, one of the words for matter, and morphe, one of the words for form, as in morphology. Aristotle took elements from all the traditions. He proposed that the permanent or passive principle is matter, and the active principle is form. So when a change occurs, indeterminate matter exchanges one form for another. Or in Aristotle's conceptual structure, the material substrate, which has form 1 at the beginning of the change, it is actually, and we're going to talk about this a lot more when we get to Aristotle, it is actually form 1. The water is cold. And then after the change, before the change, it is actually cold and potentially hot. And in the actual change, it actualizes its destination form. So matter exchanges cold to hot, or hot to cold, depending on the direction of the change. And so he explains that there is a principle of permanence, and there is a substrate that is still there, conservation of matter and energy, if you will, that there are consistent ideas that have full meaning and cannot change in and of themselves. He's agreeing with Parmenides here. Cold, what is, cold is cold. Hot is hot as a meaning, as a linguistic, logical meaning. And that the exchange is the act of something. It's literally the act. It is the actualization of something that was potential. And he explains all phenomena in terms of four causes, which we will discuss later on when we get to Aristotle: the material cause, the formal cause, the efficient cause, and the final cause. And he says that the Pre-Socratics had uncovered the first two. They understand the causes of things, but only the first two. They understood the material and the formal causes. Anyhow, early philosophy also subjected to criticisms the gods. The new thinking put traditional Greek polytheism under scrutiny. So a man named Xenophanes of Colophon, earliest skeptic to explicitly criticize the obvious anthropomorphism in the Greek depiction of the gods, two quotes that are attributed to him: "But mortals suppose that gods are born, wear their own clothes, and have a voice and a body." And then he goes on to say, "Ethiopians say that their gods are snub-nosed and black, Thracians that theirs are blue-eyed and red-haired. So everybody makes their gods look like them." And you can see on the right, the pictures, I chose two depictions of Zeus seducing women by assuming the shapes of different animals. And here he's a bull with Europa and the rape of Europa. And here he becomes the swan and he seduces Leda, Zeus and Leda and the swan. The rejection of Homeric theology was noted by the Christian theologian Clement of Alexandria. A lot of the early Christians looked to some of the Greek thinkers as people who were on the right track towards monotheism and Christianity, but hadn't received revelation yet, but were on the right path. And Clement of Alexandria is claiming this about Xenophanes. And he points out that Homer and Hesiod, the epic writers, have attributed to the gods all sorts of things that are matters of reproach and censure among men: theft, adultery, mutual deception. Here's Zeus as the seducer. Xenophanes, though, even goes further than this in saying that you can't look at the gods in terms of this anthropomorphic view that the earlier Greeks had assumed. And he posits a single immanent God, a God who's everywhere in the universe, who moves the entire universe as a principle. He's not giving up religion, but he's arguing for a brand of monotheism that we would maybe call pantheism, the universe as permeated by this high God. God is one, supreme among gods and men, and not like mortals in body or in mind. So even religion is subject to critical analysis and evaluation in the pre-Socratic world. So we've come to the last slide for today, and the questions I wanted to raise about this transition that may have resulted by the introduction of literacy. At the dawn of the classical period, I'm talking about the movement from myth to philosophy, the Greek world was still essentially religious. But among intellectuals, mythic explanation was being tested by the new mode of analysis. Now, was this simply the result of literate thought, literate thinking? Was it the result of small multicultural towns, polis, that stimulated the comparison of ideas. And one of the ideas I want to explore as we move through the course is whether the polis itself, after the Dark Age period, where you have people of multiple tribes in a small economy world living cheek by jowl in small towns, often with some semblance of primitive democratic organization, at least a place, even if it's not democratic, a place where there is a small face-to-face market of ideas, just like there is a market of other things where people have to listen to each other out in the assembly, we're stimulated by ideas that are birthed in different backgrounds, different cultures, in this small town atmosphere where literacy has been introduced. Maybe the reason this begins to happen here and not in what arguably were higher cultural opportunities in Egypt or in Asia, was because of the material base that the town culture offered, perhaps. But it's an idea that I'm suggesting now, and we'll talk about it as we go along. Anyhow, knowledge and human destiny are the result of our own efforts, is the upshot of this, not divine revelation. Heraclitus has a famous saying, man's ethos is his daimon. The daimon, the God that inspires man, he says, is the character, the ethos of the man, his daimon. He's saying the way religion used to attribute who you are and what you could become to your daimon, your genie, your internal genius, the God speaking to you within. He says, no. It's your character. It's got something to do with your fabric that you make of yourself. You are an agent, not a passive receptor. Point two, reality, whatever it is beyond naive sensory perception. This is going to take long, hard thought, and it's going to have to be considered dialectically, meaning that theories are going to be countered by counter theories and yield even better theories. They're going to be theses, they're going to be antitheses, and finally there will be syntheses. And that science is going to be progressive. We're going to learn as we go, and that it's not going to be simple. It's not going to be naive. It's going to take our full faculty, using all the capabilities unleashed by this new literate sensibility that slows stuff down and has figured out how to compare A with B. And unlike the natural world, there is this realm of mathematics and logic that has formal rules of its own and works differently than ostensibly the way nature works. And the reason I put these temples at the bottom is just to make the point that while all this was going on, lest you think that the entire world of Greece is running off to join the grand tradition of philosophy and science that has become the curriculum bequeathed to us. In the 5th century, this frenzy of temple construction and religious piety takes place. And I show 3 of the famous ones, all of which you may have visited. The Temple of Hera at Paestum, this is the 2nd Temple of Hera. All built in the 5th century. There was an earlier one that's not in as good a shape. And this is, the reason this one is in such staggering condition is because the surrounding area in the Middle Ages became a malarial swamp, and there was no civilization near it. And in the 18th century, can you imagine? There were these 3 temples sitting out here in a field, and nobody in Europe outside of a few sheep herders knew they existed. They had to get rediscovered in the 18th century after they drained the malarial swamps a bit. And the Parthenon in Athens and the Temple of Concordia in what was called Akragas, Agrigento in the modern Italian on the southern coast of Sicily. And with that, I will stop the share. If anybody wants to comment or ask a question, or feel free. I will point out that the readings as we go on from this point, if you take a peek at them, are going to make much more sense and be much more entertaining and not nearly as primitive as the guys I had you look at for today. But it was necessary to establish these first inchoate ideas. Imagine trying to do science or philosophy before science and philosophy. I mean, think of the simple way we just use these wonderfully abstract terms like substance and substrate, as if we knew what we were talking about. Anyhow. Yes, no? If not, we will resume next week with Herodotus and the invention of history and the birth of Greek tragedy all at once. Yeah, they'll say they are difficult concepts.
Lou?
Yeah.
So when they built the temples, these builders must have had a knowledge of some sort of physics and mathematics to construct them.
Yeah, but incredibly primitive. The Greeks didn't have mortar. And it's the Romans in the later period who actually developed more of a mathematics for holding up domes and things like that. These guys, those temples, if you will, were overbuilt. They couldn't calculate stresses the way we can. And so those pillars could have held up like half the planet. And remember, the roofs were light. The roofs were wooden.
They really couldn't calculate anything with using Roman numerals.
You can actually do Roman arithmetic. Somebody once tried to. I had a Latin teacher try to teach me how to do Roman numeral multiplication, and after my eyes got crossed.
It's exceedingly difficult, especially when you have to deal with fractions.
It's exceedingly difficult. You are correct. And that's why Arabic numerals in the Middle Ages were such a gigantic way forward. Anyhow. Okay, gang.
This is Joyce. And I just wanted to say thank you. When you showed us the map of how this philosophy and philosophers and where they went, and I just found it very interesting to see how spread out it was and how they traveled, and so how those thoughts traveled to different places.
Yeah, and remember, these were this was a seafaring coastal population. So the Mediterranean, up until the 18th century of the modern era, you moved at sea. I remember a historian pointed out that a letter could get from Budapest to London in about a week and a half. But to get from Budapest to the Carpathian Mountains, like 100, took like a month and a half. And it
I
was,
believe it.
so they were seafarers, and this is the beginning of Greek, and it's a point that I'll make towards the end of the class very strenuously. Greek became the first literary language. And therefore, lots of other populations will piggyback on this. And you will get Greek studies among populations that are decidedly not Greek, especially after Alexander, all the way through Asia, all the way through Egypt, all the way through the even Western Mediterranean. The new curriculum is first a Greek curriculum, and people will spend, in the Roman period, a lot of time translating stuff into Latin. And then the Arab world in the 7th century AD will spend a lot of time in the 8th century translating it into Arabic. But the ideas got around. When you invent the first curriculum, can you imagine the first collection that is of medical texts based on gathered observation? I mean, just incredibly invaluable. And so, and anytime anybody produced anything of that order, and during the so-called Hellenistic age in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC, there was a lot of it produced. It just dominated. It was as if somebody invented out of whole cloth the Encyclopedia Britannica before anybody else even had more than Run, Dick, Run, and Jack and Jill went up the hill. And here's the Encyclopedia Britannica. Well, you were either going to learn the language it was written in or get it translated into your own language as quickly as you could.
Thank you.
Anyhow, thanks for the opportunity.
Lou?
Yes.
Lou?
Renee?
Yes. Well, was Greek kind of the lingua franca then? Was it used in trade where?
It was in Greek trade, yes. But my guess is that anybody doing sea trade in the Mediterranean and in this period also knew bits of Punic, Phoenician,
Oh.
for trade purposes. But Greek will become, after Alexander in the 4th century, it will become the lingua franca. And before Rome has, so a couple centuries after this, because of its expansion, has Latin-speaking garrisons all over the Eastern Mediterranean. Latin will become something of a rival, but not really a rival. In the East, everybody will still be speaking Greek. Remember, the whole part of the world that you now think of as Arabic speaking was Greek speaking until 13 centuries ago, and had been Greek speaking for over 1,000 years. So anyhow, next year in Jerusalem, next week in Athens.
Thank you,
Lou.
Lou.
Take care, everyone.